There are only two kinds of people in the world, the disabled and the yet to be disabled. Ed Roberts. This is AMI Audiobook Review. I'm your host, Jacob Shymanski. If you don't know, Ed Roberts is one of the most revered disability rights advocates of the mid-20th century, which turned out to be a sort of golden age of disability rights activism because the movement managed to attach itself to the civil rights movement more broadly. So, people like Ed Roberts and his contemporaries were a huge reason why this golden age happened in the first place. And it's why the United States, despite its many flaws, is still, without a doubt, one of the best places to live in the world if you have a disability. That's undeniable. Anyways, this guy, Ed Roberts, was the first person in a wheelchair to study at the University of California in the 60s. That was a whole battle in and of itself, one of many that he would win in his lifetime. He was also involved in the famous 504 sitting protest in 1977. That's the one where the Black Panthers got involved. But when I was reading more about him, I learned that he did something called frog breathing. It's something some people who have issues with the respiratory muscles sometimes learn to do. The technical term is glossopharyngeal breathing. It's basically using the muscles in your mouth, throat, and face to push air down into your lungs instead of your diaphragm. That's next level adaptation. Anyways, all I'm saying is that Ed Roberts has a fascinating Wikipedia page. Look him up. Ed Rogers. All that said, I like that quote I read off the top because, well, let me read it again. There are only two kinds of people in the world, the disabled and the yet to be disabled. And I like it because it points out something so important, that being able-bodied is almost always temporary, which raises the question, if that's the case, why are so many people uninformed or ignorant about disability? Well, part of it, I'd argue, is the portrayal of disability in fiction. Books, movies, and TV shows are all over the place. Sometimes they're good, but more often than not, they're bad. Let's be honest. Today, we're talking about portrayals of disabilities in books with Red Szell. He's the host of My Life in Books on AMI Audio and a regular contributor to AMI Audiobook Review about once every 2 weeks. How's it going, Red?
Not bad at all, Jacob. How are you?
I'm doing good, man. Where do you want to start with this? I think we both have lots of points we want to bring up here. How about we start with the bad? Because that's easy.
Exactly. Well, I mean, I love that quote because actually, whenever I feel othered by people who kind of, people are scared of going blind, I think, at the end of the day. And if I feel a bit othered, I just point out that I've just got a very early onset form of macular degeneration in some ways, if they want to frame it that way. My eyes have just packed up. For most people, it happens when you're older. For me, it happened when I was younger. And suddenly it changes their perceptions. But I completely agree that, literature pretty much before the 1980s, 1990s took a rather dim view of disability. You would really only find positive disabled characters in the triumph over adversity sort of bookshelves. Helen Keller, The Story of My Life, how I, made my life worth living, even though I was blind and deaf, is how I once heard it described by somebody who was being rather damning of it. And
it's like how to defeat your disability, how to overcome it as if it's as this scourge on your life.
A dragon.
You defeat.
Yes.
Yeah, it's not a dragon you defeat, Like the fact is, and the point of that quote is to say that disability is normal. Like, think of it this way. Almost everyone who's over 80 has some sort of disability.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. That's right. Yeah, but I mean, yeah, the fear, the pity. I remember reading The Cricket on the Hearth, which is a Christmas story by Charles Dickens and features the character of blind Bertha. And blind Bertha is the most pitiable and naive character. She lives in a house with her father, who's a toy maker, and she believes that it's a clean and respectable house, isn't aware that it's filthy and, she's living on the
Oh
poverty
my
line.
God.
And part of her job in helping her father to make toys is to sew the eyes onto dolls. I mean, could Dickens have done any greater disservice to blind people than that by just making it pitiable and making her look, well, really like the village idiot? And I think, this stems from that long um, tradition of either pitying or laughing at blind people. You've got the Merchant's Tale, where by Chaucer, where a blind merchant is so blind in every respect that his wife is able to carry on an affair under his very nose. And clearly Chaucer didn't realize that most blind people know how to use their ears, but
Yeah, how would you not notice that? That's so frustrating, right? Because listen, we're two blind guys here talking about bad portrayals of blindness, and it's because we know what it's like to be blind, and we know that these representations are BS. You could totally tell if your partner was cheating on you in the other room. How oblivious do you think we are? It's so frustrating, but it's more than frustrating. It's really harmful because it exacerbates really bad stereotypes that genuinely make our lives harder, because it means everybody else around us will have much lower expectations of us, which is really frustrating and harmful in the long run.
absolutely, yeah. But I mean, let's face it, even worse is blindness as a punishment by God, a comeuppance. And Jane Eyre can only marry Mr. Rochester after he has been punished for his sins and blinded in a house fire. At which point, she can look after this pitiable former tyrant in many ways, Mr. Rochester. He's not a very nice man. But, once he's been blinded, well, that's fine. He becomes a nice person and they can live happily ever after.
I've never read Jane Eyre. What's the story here? Why does she have to marry this blind man? I'm confused.
Well, partly she falls in love with him when she is penniless and it doesn't really have any hope in life. And he is the landowner. He's got a wonderful manor house. He's the the good looking lord, if you like, and he's happy to have her as a mistress, but she doesn't want that because obviously she does have some self-respect. Actually, spoiler alert, turns out he's got a first wife locked in the loft. She is of mixed race, so I mean, there's a whole other kettle of fish there. But she's also slightly mad, the first wife, and manages to set light to the house, burn it to the ground. In trying to save her, Mr. Rochester is blinded. Meanwhile, Jane Eyre has come into a fortune, discovered that she has a family, and the boot is very much on the other foot. But, that's fine. She can keep her self-respect and marry the man that she loves because now he's been taken down a peg and is blinded. Other people may disagree with my interpretation of the book, but certainly that's how I came away feeling about it. He needs to be brought down a peg or two, and that punishment, written in a time when most people believed in God, can clearly be seen as divine retribution.
And that's a message that a lot of blind people, and this is based on a lot of lived experience and conversations with blind people that I've had, that a lot of people attribute blindness and disability to either some message or some challenge that's been bestowed on you by God or a downright punishment. I've heard of people, some blind people, that they get approached by a stranger and say like, "Oh, you've been punished by God, like you're a demon." Like they literally see you as like a representation of God's wrath. What kind of message is that sending? It's horrible. It's super toxic. I've been in many Ubers where somebody was like, "Have you read the Bible? Are you a godly man? Maybe that might help you out." Like it's really frustrating. but let's give Jane Eyre a break here, because that book came out in the 1800s.
Yeah.
And things have gotten better since then.
They have. I mean, we have to go through the early 20th century and deal with books like The Devil Rides Out by Dennis Wheatley, where every single one of the Satanists has some form of disability. Actually, one of my, I know it's laughable, but actually written about 20 years before that, I found, I think, my first really, really positive portrayal of blindness.
Interesting. 20 years before that.
1915.
So what year would that be? Okay, wow.
Ernest Bramah, a British author, great short story writer, publishes the first of his Max Carados stories. Now, Max Carados is a blind detective. He is a man who has had a horse riding accident and lost his sight. Now, admittedly, he is independently wealthy, but he hones his other senses to be able to see the clues that sighted people should notice, but actually don't notice because they rely only on their sight. You know, that old thing of we see with our minds, not our eyes. And in the first story, The Coin of Dionysius, he is brought a case that is baffling a private detective and Scotland Yard, a coin that has possibly been switched with a forgery, and through his observations, you know, taste, touch, smell, he is able to, from his armchair, divine the truth of the case. And this is the first of 20 or 30 very Sherlock Holmes type stories written by Ernest Bramah about Max Carados. Actually, they've been recorded as a series of audiobooks a couple of times, and the BBC recorded some of them as stories. And they're bloody good, to be perfectly honest. And when Ernest Bramah was challenged by, you know, obviously the sighted critics who went, well, this could never possibly happen. You know, he's a blind chap. Aren't you just sort of dealing in the realms of fantasy? Bramah was very, very much at pains to point out that there are blind people who have succeeded in life, such as John Fielding, the blind Bow Street magistrate of the 18th century, brother of Henry Fielding, actually, who wrote Tom Brown's School Days. And he claimed to be able to identify 3,000 villains by their own voices because all these people had appeared in front of him. He also cited Helen Keller as somebody who had managed to succeed in life despite being blind and deaf, and also a very, very famous at the time mathematician who took over at Cambridge University from Sir Isaac Newton as the Lucasian professor of mathematics, a guy called, I think, John Sanderson, who was pretty much blind from birth and one of the greatest mathematicians of his time. So there's a man who championed blindness. Ernest Bramah. I mean, just if you haven't come across those Max Carados books, they're great. Great short stories.
Ernest Bramah. Okay, in 1915 is pretty remarkable to write a good portrayal of disability that isn't immediately toxic and problematic for so many reasons. And we could go on. I have lots of examples. But I do want to point something out. And if there are any authors listening interested in what makes a good portrayal of disability, the truth is it's really, really hard. Because I think there's a contradiction at work here, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this, Red. The thing you hear constantly from disability rights advocates is that our disabilities don't define us and that we're individuals beyond our disability. And that's something I really take to heart. Like my disability does not define me. I have hobbies and traits that have nothing to do with my blindness, even though I know that many people, especially new people that we meet, will often just see our blindness. That's the first thing they see. And so, as an author, here's a hypothetical scenario. So you want to write a character that has a disability. Great, but the disability can't be the only thing about your character. So imagine you have, say, a blind character who's also a lawyer, and they go through this whole legal battle. It's very dramatic when it's this whole story. But the blindness isn't the central point. It's secondary, right? Because disability, again, should not define the person, just like it shouldn't define a character. But then consider Chekhov's gun, the writing rule, where if you introduce anything to the reader, it has to be relevant. Otherwise, what's the point? Meaning that the expectation for good writing is that everything is relevant. So the expectation is that if you have a character with a disability, the disability has to factor into the plot. Otherwise, what's the point of having a character with a disability? So my question is, considering all of this, is it good representation to have a character with a disability, but the disability is irrelevant?
That is I mean, I can see publishers throwing up their hands going, but the disability has to be relevant. Otherwise, how can we class it as, a disabled detective or whatever?
Yes, very true.
Yeah, I mean, it's really tough. I mean, I remember when I submitted my first manuscript, publishers turned around and went, well, what is this? Is this a memoir of yours written as fiction? In which case it should be fiction. Sorry, it should be a memoir rather than fiction. Is this a detective story? In which case, why have you blinded your detective? You're just making his life difficult for him. And I mean,
what kind of feedback is that?
You have to remember that this was back in 2010, which was quite a long
the
time
dark
ago.
ages.
Yeah, and things have changed a lot in the last 15 years. I think, I mean, it all comes back down to writing what you know at the end of the day. I find sighted people trying to write disability and failing one of the most irksome things that I have come across in literature. And I sometimes, I had to, when I was working for the Royal National Institute for the Blind People in Britain, I was quite often asked to do sensitivity reading of blind characters in books. And it has to be said,
interesting.
It had to be said quite often. I would come back and go, yeah, just can't write that. Honestly, the whole blind people feeling people's faces is, just such a terrible trope. You just don't put it in, please.
To be clear, blind people don't really do that because it's weird. You don't want to touch your faces.
No, absolutely. Neither do I want to lick your face or anything like that. So, I mean, it is very difficult. We need to have more authentic portrayals of disability in literature generally, because it needs to be seen as a natural part of human existence. As you say, we'll all become disabled in some way, shape or form if we are lucky to live beyond our 70 years and 10. But we still need to be able to have an understanding of younger people with disabilities, because we are still othered as younger people as being the outliers in a generally more healthy world. I think the one area which has made a lot of progress over this is actually an understanding of younger people who have lost limbs, particularly in wars. I think that Paralympics has actually done an awful lot for people with disabilities to be shown to be physically active and able, actually, in many ways. And I think that's where it's really interesting, seeing a lot of the literature that's coming out at the moment, things like J.K. Rowling writing as Robert Galbraith in her series of Cormoran Strike detective novels. Now, Cormoran Strike is a war veteran who lost a leg in the Afghan war, and because he was a military policeman, but obviously can't do active service anymore, he's become a private detective. Admittedly, he needs other detectives to help him chasing down criminals sometimes, but he wants to be seen, and in many ways, in many of the pages of the book, actually comes across as a perfectly able-bodied person who, oh my goodness, every so often is flawed by the fact that the prosthetic that he wears is grinding against the stump of his leg. And I think that actually is a sympathetic and realistic portrayal of disability in contemporary fiction.
It's always an unsatisfying thing to hear when somebody says, you just need to add nuance and to represent the nuance. Having a disability, and I'll speak about blindness because that's what we can relate to. Being blind is not an all-out miserable, pitiable experience.
No.
It comes with its challenges. Don't get me wrong. There's a lot of challenges. There's a lot of things that we can do, that we can enjoy, that we can dedicate ourselves to, and that needs to be represented. I think about Maester Aemon Targaryen in the Song of Ice and Fire series, who he kind of falls into that area of like, he's just a character that happens to be blind, but the blindness is not really part of the story.
Yeah.
But he has Sam Tarly come and basically be his scribe, and it's like a key point of the plot. But it's that's pretty much the only way the blindness plays into the story. And I always liked Maester Aemon Targaryen because he was very respected. He wasn't pitiable. He had his flaws. He had a very interesting background. One of my favorite blind characters, even though he's kind of a side character and he doesn't get all that much page count.
I agree. And actually another a quite similar character, I think, in many ways, is Harry Probert Lloyd, the hero of Alice Hawkins's Tavy Valley Coroner series, which is set in 1850s Wales, with a young man who's qualified as a barrister, as a lawyer, and then discovered that he's got a degenerative eye condition, probably Stargardt's disease. And he is determined just to carry on his life as a lawyer, and to, still be respected in society rather than pitied. He covers up. He tries to pass as a sighted person. He has a trusted sidekick who is his eyes at times, but he's a barrister walking around with a clock. So why wouldn't he? And he has the benefit of some residual vision, which means that he can get away with that. But yeah, I mean, what's utterly authentic about it is his frustration. And
which is worth representing, by the way.
Absolutely. And his frustration with how people treat him when they do find out that he can't see, but he is very happy to use their embarrassment against them, to wrong foot them, to get information out of them. And I mean, I interviewed Alice Hawkins in the last series. She is absolutely brilliant. She's an observer. As she said, I've worked with deaf people in the past. I just observed blind people, and I felt happy writing a portrayal of a young man who just wants to be treated normally.
And to get back to what we were saying earlier, addressing authors directly, you should expose yourself to people with disabilities, just like you described, Red. Because that's where you find out how people with disabilities actually achieve things and do things. And that's where you break out of that box that you believe that people with disabilities don't do anything and then just sit around all day just waiting for death.
Yeah.
The truth is, like, we have workarounds, and sometimes those workarounds are fascinating. It can make for really interesting plot points in stories. But if there was a golden rule for writing characters with disabilities into your stories, it plays into just generally good advice for writing characters, regardless of whether they have disabilities or not. And that's that they have to have agency.
Yeah.
They cannot be pushed around by other characters. They have to be able to make their own decisions and have their own decisions move the plot forward. And in doing that, there's a knock-on effect where you as an author have to find ways that character with a disability can realistically move the plot forward. And that just will naturally make things more realistic, in my opinion.
I agree. I think so much of fiction is about point of view, and bringing the point of view of somebody with disabilities authentically into fiction can actually really enliven the story. But done badly, it's a death knell.
We could linger on the bad representations, but those are in the past. There are a lot of authors that want to write good characters with disabilities into their story, and I welcome it entirely. You can reach out to disability communities and do like what you did, Red, with like what did you call it? Sensibility reading or sensitivity reading?
Sensitivity reading. Yes, absolutely.
Interesting.
You know, does this really make your hackles rise? Does this portrayal of a blind person really make your hackles rise? Well, yes, sometimes it does. And to give credit to the majority of the authors who I gave feedback to, welcomed it because they wanted to tell a good and sensitive, give a good and sensitive portrayal of blindness. But I suppose I was dealing with people who'd actually already taken the trouble to write to the RNIP.
Which is already a great start. I'm sure a lot of authors just wouldn't have reached out at all in the first place. And again, it's not easy. We're not saying it's easy, but it's well worth it because it'll make your stories have distinctive characters that actually stand out. I'll tell you right now, people with disabilities often have pretty wild personalities. You can draw a lot of inspiration from that. Red, thank you so much. Always a pleasure to have you on the show. We'll talk again soon.
Can't wait. To be continued.
Of course, to be continued. That was Red Szell. He's the host of My Life in Books on AMI Audio. You can find that wherever you listen to podcasts. You can email us your feedback at audiobookrareview@ami.ca. I'm Jacob Shymanski. Thanks for listening.